In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Nomine Patris, et Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Christ is risen.
Risen indeed.
This is Timothy Flanders with the meaning of Catholic. This is the Terror of Demons morning show, reclaiming traditional Catholic masculinity. Joined as always by co-host Kennedy Hall. How you doing, brother?
Living the dream. Living the dream. How you doing?
Living the lockdown dream?
Yes. Yeah.
The lockdown dream. Realizing it. That's excellent.
It's amazing. It's I never realized how how little freedom I deserved. So I'm just glad my government has explained that to me.
Good.
Yep.
Good. All right. Glad you're in your place. So welcome to the third week after Easter.
Yes.
Here is shout out once again, Liturgy of the Home. Check it out, liturgyofthehome.com. This is the third Sunday after Easter. So we've got St. Cletus and Marcellinus, St. Peter Canisius, great performing saint, St. Paul the Cross. Yep. St. Paul the Cross is a great saint of the sort of liberal era. He dies in 1775. Contemporary of St. Alphonsus Liguori. Yeah. St. Peter of Verona, the great doctor of the church, St. Catherine of Siena. And then we have St. Joseph, the worker against the communists on Saturday. Also a first Saturday.
Oh, wow.
So first Saturday and St. Joseph this Saturday. Make sure you're making your first Saturday devotions. So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I've learned that you can make your first Saturday, even if you can't attend Mass through no fault of your own. Hence, people, it's been impossible to get the 9 First Fridays and 5 First Saturdays done in lockdown because we keep having Mass cancellations within those periods. So we can't reliably receive Holy Communion on those Saturdays. So I learned last year that if you're under lockdown, you can still do the whole thing, and you can do a spiritual communion, and you can receive Holy Communion as soon as possible from those times. It's one of those things where there's not really precedent for it in history. So the priests that were giving us advice on it were basically just like, there's nothing you can do. I mean, you're doing everything that you possibly can. So they sort of looked at it like any other indulgence, basically, where you're supposed to receive Holy Communion as soon as possible or confession as soon as possible within that short window. And then it doesn't have to be Mass. You just have to receive Holy Communion. So if you can make it happen, you can schedule an appointment, so our priests have always given us sacraments throughout this time. So for example, if your government says you can only have 10 people, let's say, for religious service, they don't really know what they're talking about. If your priests are enterprising, then they'll have, let's say you can come and receive Holy Communion and hear confession or whatever within groups, family groups all day. So ask your priests if they can do something like that if you're under lockdown, because they should be able to. I mean, it's just like if you receive Holy Communion, if you were in the hospital or something, you don't have to go to Mass as long as there's a necessary circumstance. So that's one way you can do that.
That's excellent to know. Great. So you can basically, if you can't receive Holy Communion on this first Saturday or this first Friday and this first Friday, you could get 2 Holy Communions as soon as you possibly can.
As soon as you possibly can. But you do everything else and a spiritual communion instead.
Yeah, just a review. So the first Saturday, the first Friday devotion, if I recall, there's really only receiving a worthy Holy Communion.
It's pretty simple. Yeah,
that's the only requirement.
Mhm.
Except there's 9 of them, so it's a
Yes.
little bit. There's it's more than obviously it's a little bit more further. And then I also have, if you go to meaningofcatholic.com/articles, I have a breakdown of how to complete the first Saturday devotion.
Mhm.
So you have Spirit of Reparation,
Mhm.
Confession, the Spirit of Reparation, Reparatory Communion, recitation of 1/3 of the Holy Rosary, which is 5 decades, and then 15 minutes of mental prayer.
Also, you can, if you're going to mass, because it's hard when you have little kids, let's be honest, to find. So you can break these things up if you need to. So for example, like let's say you can go to mass on Saturday. Okay, great. You can pray the rosary on your way in, let's say, while you're driving in with your family, or a family rosary, whenever you do it. But the kicker is, where do you find 15 minutes for mental prayer as a parent with 4 little monkeys climbing around you at church? I mean, and then, I mean, we'll just sit for 15 minutes after mass is done with our kids. No, you won't, because you just got through the hour that you had to get through with them in the first place. So one of the priests actually told me that, while you're in mass, you can meditate on the topic while you're in mass. And I was like, oh, that's right. You're supposed to receive Holy Communion, which ideally is a mass, but again, doesn't have to be, because you can receive Holy Communion in other ways. And then if you can attend mass, then you can meditate on the mysteries while you're in mass. So there's one way of, I have little kids, obviously, and it's not, my kids behave pretty well now. They're getting pretty good. But obviously 15 minutes without having to think about any of them is not really going to happen. So I'll have my missal, but instead of a missal, if let's say you bring your missal during mass, you could bring a meditation on the first Saturday topic, right? And you can get during mass.
That is a great idea. Yeah, mental prayer was far more often practiced before even the 20th century. And yeah, it is unfortunate, even among Latin mass communities, there's not as much of a rosary or mental prayer or that type of thing. It's usually either you're just doing the missal, and missal's great. And obviously the missal prayers are objectively higher than, your personal prayers. But if you are personally more edified by mental prayer or what have you, but especially that's a great idea. Great tip for parents. So this week we are going to attempt to get through this decade, which we didn't even get into the decade last time. We talked about the end of the Great War, the punishing Spanish flu, and I made a huge error last week. Few people corrected me. So the Spanish flu did not kill 1/3 of the world. It infected 1/3 of the world.
Right.
I said it killed 1/3 of the world. I was reading the Wikipedia article too quickly. I'm sorry. Yes, but people corrected me. So it infected 1/3 of the world, and it killed. I think it was like
50 million or something.
It was something like 1% or something, 3%, something like that. Don't quote me. I'll have to look it up. But I know it was 1/3 infected.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right. That's why when the whole plague that we're going through right now started, I think they said it was going to have a 3% death rate, and they were like, that's like the Spanish flu, because even though obviously the survival rate objectively was high, it was, for a flu to get 3% of the people that it infects is a really high number.
Yeah, so COVID, according to the numbers, COVID has infected about 10%. Now it's likely it's probably more like 20% because people don't unreport or they don't have symptoms or whatnot. Obviously, most people recover from COVID. There's like death rates like 0.1%. So the only reasonable argument that I've seen, Kennedy, is if people are concerned about long-term effects with the respiratory effects of COVID, which obviously can affect people who are certainly more susceptible. Anecdotal evidence is obviously some healthy people are infected, but once again we have the lockdowns and all this stuff. But we'll try to get into the actual decade here finally. So God punishes the world with the Spanish flu. Now, so during this decade, the Bishop of Fatima is basically investigating Fatima, right? It's improved 1930 something.
Yep. It was approved by their bishops. Yep.
And you said it was still a local event, right? It's still kind of local to Portugal in terms of its.
Yeah. And I was actually reading, I've talked about that book before, Our Lady of Fatima by Professor Walsh, William Thomas Walsh, I think. It's a really, really good book. Actually, I like to read it. It's like a devotional read when you read about, it's really, those children, man, they make you well up when you're reading the story. They're saints. I mean, it's unbelievable. But there was a huge resistance to the movement. Portugal had gone through a revolution in about 1910. I don't know if it was bloody and as much as other places, but what was going on in Portugal at the time, and this is why Our Lady of Fatima is so important for those of us in countries who are being persecuted by the governments, by our Masons and communists now that call themselves politicians. It was the case where in the cities in Portugal, basically priests were being taken away, they were being arrested, churches were being seized, that sort of thing. Like that was all going on, and it was going on piecemeal throughout the country. And basically it was kind of just the rural Portuguese who were holding on to these, what they called superstitions of praying the rosary and going to mass, basically. And the gentleman, I forget his name, Fatimists will be like, how can you not remember his name? Anyway, the mayor, technically he wasn't a mayor. I don't know what his position was. He was a Mason, like an actual Mason as far as Masonry goes, Freemasonry. And then I believe he was actually a tradesman, blacksmith, if I'm not mistaken. So he was a Mason and a Smith, but different types. And he was a young man. He was in his early 30s, and he had risen up the ranks in Masonry and whatever. And there was a vehement
Arturo Santos.
There you go, Santos. Yeah. There was a vehement anti-Catholic streak that was going through, to the point where we'll find out. Well, we already went through the apparitions, but the children were actually basically sequestered for about a week, or a few days, whatever it was. In the August apparition, that's why the August apparition was late. And I mean, think about that. I mean, how insane do you have to be to basically take a few little kids as a grown-up because they say they're seeing the Virgin Mary? We forget Freemasonry is a religion. It's a demonic religion, and it's the religion of the devil. Basically, it's the culmination of all those things. And they're not atheists. They're materialists in a sense, but they're pantheists, really. And they hate monotheism in the sense that we understand it. They hate revelation. They hate the preternatural, supernatural movement in our lives. And they can't stand the fact that people would flock to things like apparitions and so forth. And so they really persecuted this situation. And as the crowds began to grow at the apparition appearances and things, more and more of these skeptics and Masons would basically come to see if they could debunk this whole thing, to the point where, the newspapers and stuff were there, and they had to write about the miracle of the sun. And they said, oh, yeah, it actually happened. That was crazy. I don't know how to explain that. So there was a huge Masonic movement going on in Portugal at the time. And it seemed like Portugal was basically to the point where it was going to be swallowed up, like France had under the French Revolution and so forth. So basically communism was on the rise in Portugal at the time. It was going into the 1920s.
Yeah, and this is exactly what's happening in Mexico at the same time.
Yes.
They're attacking Our Lady of Guadalupe with the Mexican communists. So we'll get into that. So what's really interesting, but what we talked about last week was Spanish flu punishes the world. Mm-hmm. Our Lady had come to the children and said, do you wish to accept suffering, to offer reparation? and the two other children besides Lucia do suffer and die during this plague, the Spanish flu. They die of the Spanish flu, 1919, 1920. Mm-hmm. But what's really interesting, and the key part about the 1920s is that both the Marxist revolutionaries and the Masonic revolutionaries both promote sexual revolution.
Yes.
Using different means. Yeah. And this is why we see in this era, we see that these are both really just part of one conspiracy. And they're going to, especially after World War II, there's going to be America versus the Soviet Union, but it's really just a Masonic conspiracy on one hand and a Marxist conspiracy on the other. And they're just kind of doing the same thing.
Two sides of the same coin.
Reaching the same ends. They're both promoting sexual revolution and feminism. But they do it differently. And so on the one hand, we have massive changes in both politics, economics, and the family. Politically, we have the end of all monarchy, which was promoted by Woodrow Wilson. We have the end of Blessed Karl of Austria. Mm-hmm. He dies in this decade, in the 1920s, after attempting to regain his throne for the sake of his people. But he's pushed out. All the monarchs have pushed out. Now we have Republicanism. And Republicanism quickly turns into a mass mob movement. It's just whip up the mob, and that's what you can. This becomes an act of justice in the political realm. Just get a mob to vote for you or whatever. And especially in the Spanish Civil War in the next decade, 1930s. Mm-hmm. So you have this sort of mob mentality, and then you have the economic situation. Now, Woodrow Wilson had promoted what he called his 14 points against. There was two gospels of World War I, who we talked about. They had Benedict XV. His gospel was no war reparations, no war revenge. Just put all the borders back the way they were. Yep. Let's get back to normal life. Yep. Woodrow Wilson was promoting somewhat of a war revenge. And then the Allies went even further than that. And they punished Germany. Germany's in total economic depression. They are rapidly losing the ability to feed their own people. Yep. They were starved to death into signing this document. But what happens is, so on the one hand, in the 1920s, you have a sexual revolution that's promoted by the government itself. Mm-hmm. So you have Vladimir Lenin is promoting this free love society. Yep. Where he is basically promoting public adultery, prostitution, all sorts of things. And abortion. Yep, abortion. So child murder is becoming fast. They're promoting sodomy. They're promoting all of the worst things that we have today are being promoted by the government in Soviet Russia. And then people are coming from Soviet Russia, or they're promoting it. So Soviet Russia is coming, and they're spreading their ideas. They're spreading, the airs of Russia are spreading rapidly. People in the West are advocating for changes like this already. They're advocating for the loosening of morals, the loosening
roaring of 20s. So roaring 20s.
Yeah, this is the 1920s. So this is the first sexual revolution. Mm-hmm. So what's happening from the West, coming from America, is something called jazz music. Yeah. Jazz is a slang term for fornication. And
is it really? I didn't know that.
Yes. Both jazz and rock and roll. They're both slang terms.
Oh, rock and roll. I get that. Yeah.
And so it's important to understand that in New Orleans, this was a Catholic culture founded by the French, which was a blended culture of French and African elements, which had been growing for many generations, where the church wasn't able to stop the slave trade, but they were able to mitigate its influence and mitigate its severity. And so there was a blended African Afro-French culture in New Orleans that was growing, but it was incorporated into the American Empire in the early 1800s. Mm-hmm. And what happens is, by 1900, this musical culture, which is Catholic in its essence, is corrupted by money. Yep. And people realize that if you can just sexualize the music as much as possible and just put it in a dance hall where you just have a bunch of rhythms and you have a bunch of people of the opposite sex dancing and rubbing against each other and drinking alcohol, you can make a ton of money.
Yeah.
That's pretty great. So all these businessmen say, well, let's promote jazz music everywhere. and let's create these dance halls. In America, it's a total disaster because you have prohibition, because all these Puritans think that we should just outlaw alcohol to deal with the problem, which is a disaster because all the young people are rebelling against it. So it's a complete sexual revolution. So jazz music is one of the essential factors of this 1920s. And this is happening in New York City. It's in Berlin. It's in Paris. It's in London, especially in all of the places which are the most what Woodrow Wilson wanted, which is no economic barriers. Mm-hmm. So anybody can just come anywhere and spread this economy of sin, which is just, let's just go all party and fornicate, using the slang term for fornicate, jazz. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot more to say about that, because jazz music can have beauty in a higher sense, but in the lower sense, it's being promoted as just this economic debauchery.
And a similar thing was going on in Europe. One of the major players in modern European history is Spain, and what happened in their Spanish Revolution. That was sort of that was 1930. Well, it was before 1933, I guess, but it was bubbling up in the 1920s and things, just as it was in Portugal. And I don't think the jazz movement was going on there, but you have to understand North America is obviously different because North America is a mixed Masonic, Catholic, Protestant culture, whereas Europe was Catholic culture, at least in Mediterranean Europe, that was rebelling against its Catholicism. So when you would have libertine sexual ethics move throughout Europe, you didn't necessarily have the jazz movement, but what you had, especially if you read about Spain, is basically you had, what's be a modern equivalent? Almost like corny poetry, romance, like libertine sexual ethics. You know, you had the artist, you know, that the sort of the type of, there was no more marriage was being discouraged by the Masonic ideals. So it was basically this idea of a perversion of the Renaissance was coming back, you know, where you'd sort of the human flesh and connection was through making love, and all these expressions and stuff like come from there. So it was more of a romanticized free love movement, if that makes sense. It wasn't as grimy. It wasn't as it wasn't like ritual debauchery in the sense of making it happen in the dance halls and things, but it was basically this idea that, marriage was a shackle. So you just had to connect, and they made it very artistic in sense. So if you read, I had to read a bunch of Spanish poetry and from that era. I took a course, Spanish Civil War era poetry. That'll get you a job. So I had to read that. And, I was reading poetry from all these people that were associated with Salvador Dali, who was actually complicated, kind of pro-Catholic figure. Is that wonderful image of Christ he made.
Wasn't he converted by Fatima? Didn't he made a Fatima image?
I believe so.
Yeah.
But he was, he was complicated because I believe, yes. He was married to the same woman his whole life.
He's like Beethoven. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's
exactly.
Catholic, but
he's complicated.
Complicated.
But he was an incredible artist. That group of seven, so there was one poet I had to read. Luis Cernuda was his name. There was a lot of homoeroticism and stuff as well. So, but when you read about it, basically what it was like, there was drugs in it as well. They did a lot of heroin. They don't talk about that very much, but they did a lot of opium. And, but they were trying, it was almost like they were finding again, the libertine ethics of the stereotypes of what pagan Rome was like. So they were going through their own type of sexual revolution, but it was different. It wasn't commercial. It was attached to art. So anyway, that was going on there as well, but it had the similar process of rebelling against the Catholic order.
Yeah, so I wanted to read this. Here's actually I'm going to read from this is the new Benedict biography. So here's what he says about Berlin, the 1920s. Berlin, in particular, was on a cultural high, trying to break free from all the taboos of the Kaiser's time. So the Kaiser, the emperor, had just been dethroned after World War One. Now it's a republic. It's the Weimar Republic. But they're struggling in this economic depression. Mm-hmm. But then all of this money comes in from America with the jazz music. The unbridled capital of Berlin wanted the world to feel it was living as crazily and intensely as London, Paris, and New York put together. In Haus Vaterland, Pleasure Palace in the Potsdamer Platz had up to 8,000 partygoers celebrated each night. There were more than 100 cabarets, nightclubs, fringe shows, reviews, and gay and lesbian meeting places. One of the most famous artists of her time was Anita Berber, with her red hair and garish makeup, which she was well known for expressive nude performances, such as her vice, terror, and ecstasy dances. The French writer Jean Cassou was enthralled. Berlin, he wrote, was the youngest, most systematically crazy, and most guiltlessly perverse city in the world. So, Berlin, 1920s. And what's interesting here is we can see the sexual revolutions being promoted by the American empire economically by promoting this sort of free economy and free love. Free economy, free love. And then the Marxists are promoting it just straight out of their government. Because the American presidents aren't promoting this, but their economy is. I want to read from Christopher Dawson. Christopher Dawson writes, this is republished from a 1933 collection of essays, but this is his essay, Christianity and Sex. And he's identifying that the Marxists and the Americans are promoting the same sexual revolution. Mm-hmm. And he says that, so it's coming from Russia and North America, he says, in both cases, Russia and Soviets, there is the same cult of the machine and the same tendency to subordinate every other side of human life to economic activity. Mm-hmm. In both, the individual is subjected to a ruthless pressure, which produces a standardized type of mass civilization. And finally, we see in both societies the breaking down of the family as a fixed social unit and the rise of a new type of morality based upon the complete emancipation of sexual relations from the old social restrictions.
That's it.
So the idea is that we can now just program all of life like a clock, like a machine. And we can program the family like a machine. We can just program everything from on high and everything will be perfect when we just program it. Now, what's really interesting as well, when you mentioned art, this is also the time, the beginning of ugly churches, believe it or not, which is really funny because you'd think it's only in the 1960s, but no, it's not. Here is, if I can make, let's see if I can make this bigger. So this is Kreuzkönig in Bischofsheim in 1925. Is it a bank or is it a church? It's a church.
Whatever it is.
So this is, so as you can see, we have the beginning of a very mechanized architecture. Yeah. It's very much the machine. This is a machine is what this is. It's also the use of concrete in churches is becoming prominent. This is in France and Germany. Here's another, this is in France. This is 1930. There's the, where was the other one I had? Oh no, it's this is by Baum. I'm trying to, how do I move this thing over? There's one other one by Baum, if I can find it. So here's Dominicus Baum. This is the architect. And here's this other one from 1928. So
looks like a spaceship.
Yes, 1928. This is St. Engelbert in Cologne. So this is the mechanization of the human heart, the human soul, and it's being placed. This is the influence of secularized architecture and art theories into the church.
You know, it's what you said a couple minutes ago, how basically we started looking at the person as if they could be programmed like a clock. It really has hit me hard over the last, like we have, 4 small children and my wife, we lost a baby and stuff. And the point is we've been going through pregnancy and small childhood, all this kind of stuff for the last 6.5 years, really at this point. And the whole time I was starting my career, And when the world in BC before Corona, obviously I was working as a teacher and doing the whole, not 9 to 5, but basically 9 to 5 work a day thing. And it was impossible. I realized, and I'm like, you and Tim, one of the reasons you and I get along so well is because we're both what's the word I'm looking for? We're both very conscientious in our work ethic and what we're able to do and how little sleep we might need and stuff. So like, I'm one of the most, and I don't mean this to toot my own horn, but like, I'm one of the most hardworking people you'll find. I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to not get my job done. I'm not going to, not put in a good day's work. So I have a level of energy and stick-to-itiveness, but even myself, like, I mean, it was impossible. It was almost impossible in a sense. I remember thinking, honestly, this Corona thing has been sort of in a weird way. My wife and I, we kept praying, like, please, can we find a way where Kennedy can be home more somehow? And we didn't know how that was going to happen because the work day, and again, it's not because you have to get your job. It's not the amount. It's not the hard work. It's the schedule. It's the mechanized reality of, well, obviously you can just like schedule your life for these many hours a day. And then you'll just make sure you have your children outside of those hours of the day. And when you really try to live as a Catholic, and sometimes you have lots of children fast, and we just did. We had our children so far very fast. And I remember thinking to myself, like, this is impossible. It was impossible. And yesterday we were at one of those anti-lockdown rallies, and it was, again, it's very strange bedfellows, but there was this one lady who was speaking, and she's like a nurse. She might be kind of Christian, I don't know. She had a really good speech, and she got fired for being anti-lockdown as a nurse, basically. But she had a really good speech, and she said, the first thing I am is a mother. And I was like, okay, very good. And she was talking to this motley crew of people. Again, the only sane people alive in Canada right now are Christians, gym bros, and hippies. We all have this, at least the same goal of living a life surrounded around our health and our family. And she was talking about the need she's basically like, old Canada is gone. She's like, that's good. Now we have an opportunity with all the like-minded people here to rebuild families. Basically, she was saying family-centric, locally organized communities where we work to build each other's life up in a holistic sense. It was a pretty edifying speech. It was kind of cool to know that there's people like that around here. And it struck me as how anti-family the liberal, communist, capitalist, really, on the other hand, mindset is. You can't live like a machine. You will end up contracepting, or you will end up using natural family planning as a contraceptive, or you will have major stressors in your life, or you will have to justify shipping your kids off to daycare at a young age, sort of thing. And that's all part of the capitalist and communist plan, because ultimately they're both inspired by the same mentality. And you see that really coming into play in the 1920s and 30s.
Yes, I think the biggest thing is that both Marxist and Masons, so both the liberal American Empire and the Republican American Empire and the Soviet Empire both promote feminism.
Yes.
They promote that a woman's dignity is based on her power, based on how much she can do. You're only as good as what you can do. And so a woman has to get out of the home. She needs to go get a job, get a career, that she needs to vote. She has to be a part of the political process, or she doesn't have dignity. All of this is a lie. Mm-hmm. But the men couldn't say anything about it because they had already created their own society based on dignity as power. So they had renounced the monarchy because they said the monarchy is in itself tyranny because we don't have power over the monarchy, so therefore there's no dignity. So they had already created a society before the women revolted. So the men, what are the men going to say? Well, you can't do that, women. You can't revolt. Well, you've already revolted against authority, men.
No leg to stand on.
So there's nothing to say. It's just another revolt on the same premise. And once again, I always like to say that feminism is really a revolt against an actual injustice against women, because they had destroyed the cult of the Virgin Mary. The Protestants had oppressed women because sacramental marriage was no longer sacramental. It was just a civil ceremony or whatever. So women were oppressed, in fact, and they were revolting, but they didn't have nowhere to go. All they could do was grasp to power. So, let's see. So what happens? Because we want to get into a few of the instances of Fatima.
Yep.
So there's 1925, 1929. But before we do that, because 1929 is a fateful year with Mussolini and the Vatican, can you tell us about Mussolini, Kennedy? Because there's a reaction against the sexual revolution in general, and sort of this destruction of culture in general. And the reaction is basically fascism, to oversimplify things. So fascism is basically a revolt of powerful World War I veterans, as well as a great deal of the mass of the population. Fascism very much was a mass movement. It wasn't just a bunch of elites imposing themselves. It was an instinctual reaction of the traditional populace. They might not even be very Christian, but they realize that these morals are wrong. They just realize it. So they're moving against this with the fascists, leading to tension. So can you tell us about Mussolini?
Sure.
What we need to know about him?
So before I've already been canceled, but before cancel culture comes after a guy for doing apologetics for Mussolini, I'm Italian. Okay. So it's cultural appropriation if you don't let me do it. But seriously, when I used to live in Italy, it's an open secret that when you ask an Italian about the glory days of Italy, depending on the company and depending on how many glasses of wine they've had, they'll tell you about the Il Duce and how he built their city and how the trains run on time because of Il Duce, because how the water systems were fixed because of Il Duce, Mussolini, and how it's all lies and he was actually a pretty good guy. And that's even a liberal Italian will look back and they'll just sort of say, yeah, Grandpa said Mussolini was actually good. So what am I saying? Hold on here, Kennedy. You can't say that. Well, hold on a second. Let's just have a little history lesson here. Who were the allies in that conflict? Because everyone associate, they look at history so simplistically that they say Mussolini. Well, that's the guy who was with Hitler and the Japanese. I mean, he must have been the same kind of person. Well, if that's the case, then the Canadians and the Brits and the Americans must have been just Stalinists, right? Because we were allied with in that devilish war. The devil that the West picked was, or that the Allies picked was Stalin, who was arguably worse than Hitler anyway with the amount of things that he did. So anyway, that we can't get into that yet. But as far as what was happening in Europe, you've had Trad Patrick on before talking about it, but fascism is basically, it's not communism. That's one of the things so often with this whole corona thing, people will say, oh, we have this rise of medical fascism. It's not fascism. This sort of thing would never happen under fascism in the truest sense of the word. This is communism, what we're going through. Fascism is basically a philosophy of subsidiarity, Christian corporatism applied to politics. The word fascism basically means bundle of sticks, which is interesting because when you talk to people like Tim Gordon and stuff making apologetics for the American Empire, they'll talk about this philosophy of bundle of sticks, which is a legal philosophy. That's a fascist term. Fascism literally means a bundle of sticks. It's a word from the Roman times. So the idea in fascism is basically that if you have the three prongs of society essentially put together, then there can't be broken because it's like three sticks together. You can't break it. That's what it means. So Mussolini was not a saint. He was not a saint, but he was not a devil. He was not a pious man very much, but he was a complicated man who was born to a radically socialist father and a radically rosary praying pious mother. And he was a schizophrenic, tortured soul as a result of that. He knew that communism was wrong. In fact, you know who he's kind of like? He kind of reminds me in a sense of a man like Charles Maurras in France, Action Française, who himself was agnostic for most of his life, but understood that the only way forward for France was the traditional order. Now, in that sense, he was trying to reestablish the monarchy because France actually had a monarchy that was worth reestablishing. They had actual houses, but the Italian monarchy had become liberal itself. So Mussolini understood that there could not be a reestablishment of the Italian monarchy because the Italian monarchy was a source of the issues which were coming into Italy anyway, with seizing the Papal States and so forth that happened in the 1800s. So Italy was going through, had a bad monarchy. Okay, but Mussolini saw, as well as these movements like Franco and other people, they saw that democracy was a dumpster fire. Democracy is a dumpster fire. Okay. I joke, but actually I just did after this, people should watch my recent video on Fatima Center. It's called something like Tyranny, Monarchy, Democracy, and Church and State or something. Democracy is not Catholic. Democracy is an abomination of polity. Polity is properly understood as the involvement of the people on the lowest level within a hierarchical framework that would have an aristocracy and a monarchy. And an aristocracy, when it's fallen, is oligarchy, which is what we have today. We have unelected men, so to speak, which there will always be. There will always be unelected men of influence having some sort of influence over your life, because that's actually normal. You, Tim Flanders, in 30 years, as your beard gets a little bit more white and you lose a little bit, maybe you won't lose your hair. I'll lose more of mine, but you're a learned man. You'll be an established man with a family. It would make sense for Tim Flanders to be someone that a local community would look to as someone like an aristocrat, which basically means a wise, noble man who should be making decisions. That's just a matter of experience. That's what an aristocracy is, essentially, in the understanding of the Greek term of aristoi. Anyway, so that's the way society should function. We should have an unchanging leader, because if you don't, what you have every 4 years are these stupid culture revolutions, which you think that if your guy doesn't win, the world's going to end, which is, let's be honest, that's what it feels like every 4 years. It creates an unsustainable overturn of politicians who have to up the ante over and over and over again. And we get to this point where we have this stupid circus we have now. So that's democracy for you. And then instead of having an actual aristocracy, what you have is basically an oligarchy, which is just those with the most capital are in charge, which is not what aristocracy was. Aristocracy was those with the most, let's say, cultural influence in the truest sense, which was wisdom. Yeah. And then now we have democracy, where everyone says, I'm democratic. No, what you're doing is democracy works against itself. What you're saying is, I'm going to vote somebody in to go think for me. Polity was different. Polity is, there are certain things that should be handled at a local level, and there are many of those things. So whenever those things come up, we gather and make a decision that's best for us. Democracy is the opposite. Democracy is, out of the 10,000 of us, let's send one person to go make all our decisions. And then you don't get the right decisions, and you're like, what's wrong with democracy? It's like, you idiot. You ask somebody to go be your brain for you, and you don't like how they think. Anyway, so Mussolini saw these liberal errors. Italy had not completely industrialized yet, which is why Italy didn't really go through the Depression in the same way. So Mussolini, Franco, Salazar in Portugal, if you look up them on Wikipedia, they're always put together with Hitler. Hitler was not a fascist. Hitler called himself a socialist. That's why they're called the National Socialists. And even there, Hitler was, he was just Hitler. He was a wacko.
It was a neo-pagan philosophy based on eugenics and Darwin.
He was a wacko.
But the problem, he basically took certain fascist elements and used it in his society, and so that's why he gets clumped in with the fascists. Even though Dollfuss, who's a quote-unquote fascist, opposed Nazi and was assassinated by Nazis.
Yeah, and also you have to understand too, all philosophies, there's all different political action have certain ideas in common. One of the reasons why, we're so anti-sovereignty in our day and age, which is so ironic because of the borders under Corona. Same people asking for open borders. Now you have to have the strictest borders on earth. All of these movements were nationalist, at least in their infancy. And whenever you nationalize an economy and you reject the shell game of international finance, you have a big boom economically, because you basically fix your own house, if that makes sense. So Hitler was a nationalist insofar as he had his strange Darwinian pagan idea of the German race as this, evolved eugenic, whatever. So that really made Germany have a boom. Even in Soviet Russia, when they sort of nationalized, etc., in a sense, even though there was lots of murder and stuff, it appeared that they were having a boom. Okay, so wherever you have, wherever you come into yourself and worry about your own house, obviously you'll clean up your house. Now, it might be based on debt, and 20 years later, you're going to have to, be called to account for it. But anyway, so Hitler was not a fascist. So Mussolini was trying to reestablish, let's say, the order of Christendom, but in an age where Christendom had fallen after the First World War. So it was a way of trying to apply the philosophy of how a nation ought to operate, but without the ability to have a Holy Roman Empire, without the ability to have an actual Christian or Catholic monarch. And that's basically what he ended up doing. Italy was doing really well culturally and economically under Mussolini. Again, which every Italian will tell you if they want to tell you their dirty secrets about how they actually loved Il Duce. And then eventually, when you get through the war, we get to wartime and things. World War II, it gets whitewashed as this good guys versus bad guys thing. And definitely there are lots of stories of heroism and of men in battle. And again, Hitler was an actual wacko and a psycho. No one's denying that. But so was Stalin, and he was on our side. So we both picked a devil to go fight in this demonic war with. And a lot of the stuff that was going on, a lot of the awful stuff we hear about that was going on under the Nazis, it wasn't known to the rest of the world. It just wasn't. Mussolini did not think Hitler was a smart man. He thought he was kind of a joke. But if you look at geographically where Italy has the Levant and North Africa to its south and southeast, basically. And it has Germanic republics, which, Austria had been taken over, and Switzerland to the north, and France, and then Germany right over Switzerland. From a geographical happenstance, let's say, it was the Germanic Empire over top of Italy, and then Italy's colonies to the south, which was basically all their surrounding area. So from a perspective of, because I was thinking about this before we came on, actually, the Second World War, we always forget about Japan. Japan was an old world empire. Okay, Japan was an old pagan empire. It was, there was more in Japan in 1920s and 30s and early 40s had more in common with Japan like 1,000 years prior than it does now, in a sense. So what you find in World War II is a world that had been ravaged by liberalism, where Christendom had been destroyed essentially. And you have on the one side, objective, overt liberalism and communism with the Americans, Canadians, Brits, and the Soviets, etc. But on the other hand, you have this ragtag motley crew of, let's say, Christian-ish, Christendom-ish Italians, neo-pagan Roman Empire-inspired weird pantheistic Germans, but still establishing something like an old world empire. And then you have an Eastern pagan empire in the Japanese. And it's basically like the old world versus the new world, but both of them have lost their compass in a sense. And then it's a big mess. So Mussolini is a very complicated figure. He is not Hitler. And then his assassination, well, who was he assassinated by? Well, after the Second World War, Mussolini was still in power for 2 more years. And basically the Allies, so Americans and so forth, they found his location and gave it to the communists. So, he was killed by communists. So, it's like, who's the bad guy there, basically, right? And that's Mussolini. So he was a complicated figure, but Italians are quite fond of him.
Yeah, so we can see fascism as this reaction attempting to reestablish something. Now, once again, Christopher Dawson, Religion and the Modern State, he writes in the 1930s, this is page 135, he says, there seems no doubt that the Catholic social ideals set forth in the encyclicals of Leo XIII and Pius XI, this is 1931, the second social encyclical, have far more affinity with those of fascism than with those of either liberalism, American Empire, or socialism, the Soviet Empire. So he's saying fascism definitely instantiates the Catholic ideal better. But then he says there still remains a wide gap between the Catholic and fascist ideals of the state. And what he says is the fascist takes over too much of the church's power.
Yes.
Because fascists, and part of this is because they were, Franco's scared of communists, so he's trying to, which ultimately was justified later on. But the fascist powers were taking too much control from the church. And that brings us to the Lateran Treaty in just a minute. But I wanted to ask you about 1925, and I wanted to answer. We got like 10 more minutes, but one more quick point is that in 1930, so this decade of sexual revolution, 1930 is when contraception is approved by the Anglicans. This is the first time that any Protestants have ever allowed contraceptive in 1930. So this is the result of the first sexual revolution, is contraceptive. So 1925, let's bring it back to Fatima. 1925, the Blessed Virgin Mary with her son appears to Sister Lucia, requests the devotion of the first 5 Saturdays. So this is in the heart of the sexual revolution, 1920s. Comments on that before we talk about the Lateran Treaty.
Well, heaven knows what it's doing. So you have an abomination, an exaltation of the sins of the flesh, an anti-Marian, anti-purity, anti-chastity movement. And so now you have the Blessed Mother establishing, and you have the Blessed Mother establishing a devotion to her pure and immaculate heart, which is the embodiment of human purity. Okay, so it's the most chaste thing you can imagine, which is a remedy for the sins of the flesh, which wound our Lord so much.
Yeah, so the 5 first Saturdays are reparation for blasphemies against the Immaculate Heart. And I definitely, I see the same thing as you. God knows that if we turn to the Virgin Mary and we
fix everything,
we venerate the Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary is the throne of Christ on earth. That's how Christ became king of the earth. Christ the king on earth came to his crucifixion and resurrection was through Mary. She's his throne.
She's a human monstrance.
And the let's see, Christ the King. When was Quas Primas?
25.
Was it 25?
I believe so.
Let's look it up real quick. Yep, 1925, December 11. So December 10. Oh, look at this. Look at this. Yeah, December 10. Blessed Virgin Mary, prayers to Sister Lucia, says we need the first Saturdays now. This is December 10, 1925, and then the very next day, December 11, 1925, is Quas Primas, Christ the King, establishing Christ the King Sunday.
And then the next day is what? Guadalupe.
Our Lady of Guadalupe.
All back to Guadalupe, which is linked with Fatima.
And we have the Cristero War is just coming to the fore as well. 1920s. It starts to really heat up. I'm looking at the dates here. But so anyways, now, finally, in 1929, the Lateran Treaty is signed, which is where Mussolini gives back from the seized Papal States. Mussolini gives back a tiny fraction of the Papal States, which is the modern Vatican City of today. Did I lose anybody? Are you there, Kennedy? I think we lost connection. Let me see if I can restart this. Okay, we lost the stream for a second. Let me know in the chat, am I coming through properly? I'm not sure if I am or not here. But we lost Kennedy for a second. But so 1929 happens, and that is when Mussolini gives back a tiny fraction of the Papal States to the Vatican, creating the country of the Vatican, a Vatican City. Okay, so we'll try to get Kennedy back in. So what's important to understand is that the Papal States essentially encompassed the middle chunk of Italy. We have northern Italy with Milan, Venice, and then we have the middle chunk is basically the Papal States, and then the bottom chunk was the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, and the modern Vatican City is a tiny fraction of what the Italian Empire took from the Vatican in 1870. So we're trying to get Kennedy back in on in the stream to give his comments on the Lateran Treaty. But this is what happens also in 1929. Communism is firmly victorious as Stalin consolidates his power, launching the persecution of the church.
I'm back.
Let's see. It looks like Kennedy is totally
Can you
back.
see me now?
Yeah. So, Kennedy, tell us about.
My internet died. Sorry.
No problem. So I was just commenting on the Lateran Treaty basically gives back the Papal States a tiny fraction of the Papal States.
Mm-hmm.
So what can you give us any comments on the Lateran Treaty in terms of Mussolini? I mean, to me, it seems like a pretty bad deal.
Okay, but let's actually, so you mentioned Franco. This has something to do with it. So again, liberal Masonic infiltration, whatever you want to call it, of the church did not begin in the end of the Second Vatican Council. Or it, there were already major problems in the church, and one of the things, it goes even back to the Council of Baltimore, and Americanism. You know, there was this idea that priests should not wear cassocks; they should wear the clerical suit or something like that to blend in, basically, with the Protestants. There had been this encroachment of liberalism in the church for a century. This is why, I mean, Pius X was fighting modernism in 1910. I mean, if it gets to the point where you can have a defined heresy by one of the greatest popes we've ever had in 1910, that's obviously been brewing for long enough that he could establish a body of work going against this synthesis of heresies. This has been going on since the French Revolution, or the process. I mean, it's been going on for a long time. Even at the time of the French Revolution, you found Masons in the hierarchy and so forth. So Mussolini was, and his advisors, this is the thing, he had tons of priests and holy men who were advisors of his, and he would consult. The church was already a mess as far as politically establishment goes, you know. So Franco saw this. So Dawson, and also Christopher Dawson's writing in the 1930s. I'm sure if Christopher Dawson, when did he die? I don't know. Was it
1970?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure if he had have seen what happened to Spain at the end of Franco's life, he might have said Franco was correct. Because after the Second Vatican Council, liberal Rome, the Vatican, asked Spain to stop having basically the kingship of Christ in the confessional state in their constitution. And within a few short years, Spain had completely devolved into modernist secularism and is a total dumpster fire now of anti-Catholicism, to the point where those communists are trying to take down crosses and things like that. It's almost, you know, God uses the fact that Mussolini and Mussolini and Franco and stuff were outside of the church hierarchy, but they themselves had a Catholic sense and understood it in that sense of Charles Murat knew that the church had to be established as the way the country should run. They were able to critique it almost without any emotional reservation. So Mussolini looked at the crop of Catholic leaders in the church and went, "Nah, you're not going to be in charge of this stuff because you'll be worse for the church than I will." That's kind of the idea. Okay. So that was pretty much the idea that Mussolini and men like Franco had. And again, history tells you how good your idea was. And we have the example of Spain, and look at Italy today. And Italy after Mussolini's reign, I mean, it was a continual encroachment of secularism, and Rome, which obviously is a sovereign state, but it's in the heart of Italy. If you go to Rome, it's the most pornographic city you'll find. As far as I remember as a kid being there and being like, "Oh my goodness, how is this legal?" You know, the billboards and the magazines and everything, and that's where the seat of Christ on earth is in that city. So. Yeah, it was foresight that we didn't know the extent until later.
So yeah, so this is an important point that we'll get into far more later as well. So just so everybody understands, this is the Papal State, the left side of this, the 1815. This is essentially Italy as it existed for centuries and centuries, with various republics and kingdoms. This is the ideal of republic are these small republics. That's when the republics actually work. But you had these different things. This is the Papal State. So this is the Pope was a monarch over this area right here on the green, the Papal States. Now, the Vatican City is a tiny portion of the city of Rome. It's not even the whole city of Rome. This is the Vatican City right here. This is Google Maps right here. This is Vatican City. This is a separate country. And it's just a portion of Rome. So if I zoom out here, we see that's a little tiny part of the city of Rome, as you can see. So that's the difference between the Papal States and Vatican City.
You see there, Lucca in the map on the left?
Yes.
That's where I lived.
Oh, excellent.
It was a medieval kingdom as a city.
There we go. Yeah. There we go. So definitely objectively speaking, we can certainly say that this was a tiny reparation by Mussolini compared to what was seized by the Italian Empire. This whole area is gone. This is why the Pope, this is why we pray for the liberty and exaltation of Holy Mother Church. That prayer was added because the church was in captivity. That was been seized by the Italian Empire. So,
and again, though, I will say, though, the infrastructure was gone, though, too. So if you look at those dates, 1870, 1860, that's 60 years or 50 years, basically. The governing structures of those places had been completely liberalized. So the only person who could control this is also last thing I'll say about these men, Mussolini and Franco and stuff. They're always known as being these militaristic men. Well, you have to understand something. There was absolute chaos of morals and economics in society to the point where, again, please, people, think about democracy rationally here. Look at what's happening. Like, for where I am right now, okay, there's no possible way that this situation I'm living in right now, this stupid communist lockdown, which is one of the most egregious human rights abuses in the history of mankind, there is no possible way that this will ever be fixed democratically. It won't happen. It will not be, at least quickly. It might take 10, 50. There was a police officer speaking yesterday, and he's a retired police chief of a major. And he said, you know what's really, he said the saddest thing for him is, he said, the decades of trust that the police have established with the people of Ontario. He says it's going to take 2 or 3 generations. And he's just being honest. He says it's going to take 2 or 3 generations for you to trust the police again, because you don't know if one of those men is going to come into your church and drag you out on Easter Vigil because you're not wearing a face diaper. That's the situation we live in right now. This pales in comparison, in a sense, to what was going on in certain places with these Masonic revolutions, which were literally dragging priests off. It was overt. Okay. The only way to establish order in a society that's that chaotic and democratically ridiculous is basically through enforcing things using the power of the state. That's the reality. People don't want to admit that. There's where I live right now. It'll be 10 years of a vestige of this in some fashion or another. And it'll be a clown show for us until the coming of Christ. Men like Franco, for example, they looked at what was happening. There's no reasoning with the communist. You can't. There's no reasoning with the communist. They
don't believe in truth.
No, and it's a culture of death. It's a culture of death where it's a suicidal reality. And that's what we're seeing an example of it right now. You won't go down to city council and say, hey guys, want to think rationally? The polls say, my constituents say, it won't happen. It will not happen. The only way it can happen is either hopefully peacefully through a movement of people pressuring their politicians, basically by force, though, if you think about it. It's a threat of, we won't vote for you again, this, that, and the other thing. Or it has to happen, or it will happen violently. And you will see that today on Earth. You will see, not in Canada, we don't have you will see that in places in Europe. You will see a fascist resurgence in places like Greece and Italy.
So you're saying that when Mussolini gave back Vatican City, he was actually keeping the church safe, or at least some sort of civilization safe, by keeping that vast majority of the Papal States, because all of that vast majority was liberalized and communist.
And I'm saying you had to have a military. You had to have a military to keep the order, because the communists will not reason. history has proven that if they're in charge, they'll kill millions of you. If they're not in charge, they're terrorists. That's it.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a fair point. So 1929 also is when the Roaring Twenties come to a startling and depressing halt with the crash of the economy. So this economic boon, so-called, which is very much the economy of sin, happens, and we have the fall of this economy with the depression sets in the fall of 1929. And
which didn't happen in Italy.
Yeah, so we'll talk about the Depression era. So then we have the 1930s. And at this time, the Nazis in Germany have been the Weimar Republic has been total chaos during this time. It's been sexual revolution on the one hand. It's been communists on the other hand. It's been the psychological mass movement. Wilhelm Reich is writing books called The Sexual Revolution that gets published later. Ed Bernays is engineering using social engineering. That was happening in World War I.
Freud's nephew. What was he?
Freud's nephew. Yep. He's in America, but that's been happening everywhere. They're using psychological manipulation. And the Nazis are basically street thugs during the 1920s. They're just killing, beating up communists. Initially the Catholic bishops excommunicate any members of the Nazi party. The Joseph Ratzinger Sr., the father of Benedict, was a police officer who was breaking up Nazi brawls during this period.
Which started in beer halls.
Yes, and also 1920, was it 27 and 28? But the parents of Jorge Bergoglio, they left Italy. They didn't like Mussolini. They left Italy. They went to Argentina. I believe it's 1928 when Jorge Bergoglio is actually born in Argentina. So he's Italians. They leave. But
did they leave before? When did they leave?
I don't know when they left. I read that it was fleeing Mussolini. That's what I read. I don't know when.
I wouldn't be surprised if that was a modernist liberal propaganda from
maybe it was.
I'm just saying, just because I thought Mussolini came into power in 1922, so I'd like to see when they came.
I'm sorry. I got the dates all wrong. Sorry. 1936. He's born later, 1936, in Argentina, of Italian immigrants. And let's see. I don't see quickly here.
There was a massive diaspora. There was a massive diaspora in actually, I did my final thesis or whatever on this was in a.
Yeah, they left in 1929.
Okay.
This says
my final thesis in university was on lunfardo, which is an Italian dialect, and that's where tango music comes from. Actually, I guess it's kind of like jazz in the South, but it's a Napolitan dialect. There were so many Italians. Right now in Argentina, a quarter of Argentinians have some sort of Italian blood. There was more Italians in Argentina than there was in New York in the late 1800s. Buenos Aires. Yeah. Anyway, so that's his family's part of that diaspora.
Excellent. So this is the period. So Fatima is becoming more prominent. It is being investigated. It's when does Pius? Here'll be our last point on the show. When does Pius the 11th actually get informed about Fatima? Do you know?
I don't know off the top of my head. No,
because Pius the 11th does not act on Fatima.
No,
he doesn't do anything. Now, to be fair to him, that may be because of his advisors. He did have bad advisors who advised him against Padre Pio, advised him against the Cristero War. He had bad advisors. He was a good pope in other ways, but so we don't know if that was bad advice or if it just wasn't prominent enough. Maybe it hadn't become much of a mass movement yet, perhaps. But 1925, the first Saturdays are commanded by Our Lady. So, just a reminder: this Saturday is a first Saturday. Remember to make your first Saturday. So let's offer up a Pater Noster, especially against sexual revolution, which we're now dealing with the second or third sexual revolution. But this was the first.
New type of roaring 20s coming our way.
Yep. All right. So let's pray. In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater Noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitti nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Christ is risen.